Again, it's me doing more maths for week 8. So let's have a look. I actually really like how the book has set out its stuff for 24-hour time zones. So we might look at that, okay? Okay, first question. Find the difference in hours and minutes between the following 24-hour times. So the first one we've got is 06:35, which as you know is 6:35 in the morning, and 21:50, okay, which is obviously past 12 o'clock. And that is our greatest time, the largest number, and that's what we start with. So 21:50 is what we're going to write down first. You can see we've put a bit of space in to separate the hours and minutes because that's the greatest time, okay? And then we're going to deduct 06:35 because that's the smaller of the two times, okay? So if I've got 50 minutes in my first one and I take away 35, I'm left with 15 minutes. And if I've got 21 hours on the first time and I take away 6, I'm left with 15. So 15 hours and 15 minutes is the difference between these two times, okay? A really user-friendly way to set that up. The second question, between 10:55, okay, obviously that's AM, and 15:43, this is obviously PM. So this is our largest number. We're going to start with that to deduct it. So 15 hours and 43, and our smaller number was 10:55. So 10:55. Again, I've left a bit of a space. I haven't, but the book people have, between the hours and minutes so we don't get confused. So 43 take away 55 and 15 take away 10. Okay, we can't do that because we have a larger number on the bottom than we do on the time. So than we do on the top. So we need to convert 1 hour into 60 minutes and add it to the column. So that's going to become, instead of, we're taking 1 hour away from here, like we would borrow when we're deducting normally, instead of 15 hours, we're going to change that to 14 hours. And the 10 comes down as usual, and that's going to be 60 plus 43. Now, when I add 60 minutes from that extra hour I took away to 43, I get 103, and the 55 remains the same. Okay, so now let's try and do this. 103 take away 55 leaves me with 48 minutes, and 14 hours take away 10 leaves me with 4 hours. So 4 hours and 48 minutes is the difference between those two times. Okay, so as we travel around the world, in Europe it's night time, when in Australia it's daytime, and vice versa. To help everyone know what's going on, we got 24-hour times, okay, and we have talked already about how confusing they are. So let's just go to Perth, Melbourne and Jakarta, okay? So when it's 3 o'clock in Perth, it's 5 o'clock in Melbourne and it's 2 o'clock in Jakarta, okay? So if we travel east, we need to set our watches ahead, okay? So if you're going from West Australia to Melbourne, your clock's going ahead, as shown here. And if you are travelling west, you set your watches back. Now, what I've just written, I wrote it on the book, don't tell Mrs. Marshall. What I put to remind myself is that you might have noticed when you're interacting with people from the US online, we are a whole day ahead of them in many ways. But in time, we are one full day ahead of the Americans. So my friend moved from Burnie to LA, and when I wish her a happy birthday, okay, I'm doing that the day before it happens. If I want to wish her a happy birthday on her birthday, I need to wish her a happy birthday the day after her birthday. So in Australia specifically, we've got 3 time zones, okay? We've got Queensland, New South Wales, the ACT, Victoria and Tasmania are all in Eastern Standard Time. And you'll hear that sometimes on some radio stations. They'll say, oh, it's 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, or it's 7 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time if you listen to the BBC like my mum. Anyway, so the Northern Territory, South Australia observes Central Standard Time, which is half hour behind our Eastern Standard Time. And Western Australia observes Western Standard Time, which is 2 hours behind the Eastern Standard Time, okay? The time in England is Greenwich Mean Time, and we talked about that. So they're 10 hours behind our Eastern Standard Time. And you know, the whole world sets their time from Greenwich Mean Time. So the time in London, which is Greenwich is just a little city outside of London, is 7 a.m. In Jakarta, it's 2 p.m. In Perth, it's 3. And in Melbourne and Tassie, it is 5, okay, 5 p.m. And they give you some examples there along there. So the first example here, what's the time in Melbourne if the time in London or Greenwich Mean Time, you've got to get used to these little acronyms, is 8 a.m. Okay, so if London time is 8 a.m., Melbourne time is going to be, let's have a look, London and Melbourne. If it was 7 a.m. in London, 5 p.m. in Melbourne. So what we're doing is we're adding 10 hours, okay? 8 a.m. plus another 10 hours means it's going to be 6 p.m. The second question, what is the time in London, Greenwich Mean Time, if the time in Melbourne is 8 a.m. Okay, so now we're looking at Melbourne and London. Oh yeah, we were doing it the reverse way the other time. Okay, so if Melbourne is 8 o'clock and London is 8, we're going the opposite way now. We're reversing 10 hours. Then it's going to be 10 p.m. the previous day. And it's really easy to get totally bushwhacked when you're talking about the previous day and the day after, okay, like I talked about with my friend in LA. Many countries around the world have daylight savings time during summer, so people can make the most of warm weather. We are very obviously one of those. When daylight savings time begins, clocks are turned forward by 1 hour at 2 a.m. And at the end of daylight savings time, the clock's then turned back by 1 hour at 3 a.m. So if you are my car, you stay on that same time and you complain about how you're an hour ahead until it goes back, and then your time in your car is telling the right time. In Australia, the states Queensland and Western Australia and the Northern Territory do not observe daylight saving time. The reason why, it's not really that essential for them. Here in Tassie, we run out of daylight hours, okay? And you all know what it's like to get home at 4:30 in the afternoon and it's already bloody dark. And the same thing when we're getting up in the dark, okay? So we use the daylight savings time to try and get as much daytime as we can, or light. Use as much light as we can. During daylight saving, the time in Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales and ACT is known as Eastern Daylight Savings Time, EDT, Eastern Daylight Savings Time. The time in South Australia is known as Central Daylight Savings Time, or CDT, and during daylight savings time, Queensland is 1 hour behind, Northern Territory is 1.5 hours behind, South Australia is half hour behind, and West Australia is 3 hours behind, okay? So if you want to call your friend in Darwin on Christmas Day from your home in Sydney, it's 7 p.m. in Sydney. What time is it in Darwin, okay? So Sydney is Eastern Daylight Savings Time and Darwin is Central Daylight Savings Time. So the time in Sydney is 1.5 hours ahead of the time in Darwin. So if we're at 7 o'clock in Sydney, okay, then we need to take away 1.5 hours because we are 1.5 hours ahead. So taking away 1.5 hours leaves us at 5:30. All right. I hope that you got a little bit of that. I know it is very, very confusing. I'll snip out these things that you need here and pop them on Canvas for you too. Ciao!